Thanks everybody for coming. This again is the opening session for the education track that Apereo, the Apereo Foundation was responsible for, and I think we have a lot of really interesting talks coming up over the next 2 days. So hopefully a lot of y'all will stay in this room and see those great talks. For this is actually not a talk, it's a discussion. So for anybody you expecting a bunch of slides, there's 3 slides altogether, including this one. So I'm hoping that we can all learn a little bit from each other and each other's experiences, and also think outside the box on ways that academic open source, both projects and contributions from academia, can find sustainable pathways, because I think that's still a huge question. And just to introduce myself and my background and the reason why this all came up for me as a question was because I'm from UC Santa Cruz. My name is Stephanie Ligi. I run the Center for Research in Open Source Software, which is part of Basket Engineering at UC Santa Cruz. I also manage and run the burgeoning open source program office at UCSC, as well as chair the leadership group for the open source program office at the UC network. So the University of California network of open source program offices. And that's very much a burgeoning kind of work in progress. And we have 6 campuses altogether that are under that network. And our hopes is to get all of our campuses, which is 10 in total, to have some level of an OSPO as part of that work. And a couple people are going to talk about that effort through this track as well. And then Laura, who's actually on a different track, Laura Langdon, who's in the audience, is also talking about our network in a separate track as well. So there's a couple of us here talking about all that work. But I'm not going to talk about that too much today. I'll let my colleagues go over that. But like I said, so one of the things that started me thinking about this issue, obviously it's really hits for me and my position fundamentally about how not just my position is sustainable, but how our ultimate goals of both CROSS, the center I work for, and our OSPO effort in general, how those can be sustainable and also have impact. And this is kind of just a quick background of what, it's kind of written a little bit of what was in the abstract for this session as well. But what I've always felt is that universities have have been definitely a strong source of open source projects and contributions over time. And I look at, I mentioned in the abstract, and Ceph, which came out of UC Santa Cruz. It's the reason I have a job, because all of my funding came from, at the beginning, came from Sage Weil. And then, but RISC-V, Jupyter, you name it. There's I think I have another slide just from which, has what you see campuses have done, let alone all the other universities. And so, but at the same time, much of it's created in academia really actually doesn't get out of academia and kind of gets lost. And I don't think that there's a full understanding of that lost opportunity. What I love about open source and what drives me crazy about when things aren't open source is this idea of rebuilding things that were already built by somebody else at one point, but you didn't know it was there because it got lost. And so I really think that's a huge important part of what open source should be about. And these potential, what's coming on academia and then getting lost because somebody graduates, leaves, change, funding cycles, you name it. There's a lot of reasons why this happens. Those issues, I think, are something that is fundamentally a challenge within all of academic research, and it would be kind of trying to identify pathways to avoid that or to help at least mitigate some of those issues. And we're dealing with some structural issues as well as a lack of capacity. So I don't think universities quite get what they could do and potentially be able how to empower their researchers to go beyond kind of the funding cycle or beyond what currently is kind of the norm in academic research. And we really need a better understanding of what to do next for our researchers, as well as for those who really want to have an impact from the university on the greater good outside of just the campuses. So anyways, these are my suggestions. I'll leave this up. I don't necessarily feel like I want to go through like one at a time, but I was kind of, these are the questions I kind of had in my head. I was hoping kind of to throw it out to the group. One is the first one though. I do think is I really would like to hear from other folks what the pathways that are particularly that people have seen as particularly well suited for academic, or I call it academic originating open source. It's kind of a big word, but the idea is an idea of a projects and that are started as maybe a research like software, but really have an potential impact for a much broader set of users, a much broader set of audience. And then I also was hoping to kind of have a discussion about how sustainability works for academic open source and how is it different from all the standard sustainability questions in open source projects. Of course, I can't not talk about funding. So I really would like to have more of a discussion about, in general, about how fiscal sponsors fit into this. That's always a question I get once academics, I get projects, especially now that we have, for those of you who are not aware of this, an SF project program called the Pathways for Open Source Ecosystems, POSE projects. There's a lot of, they get a year or 2 year grant, and then it's like, okay, and then what? It's kind of the whole same problem of the funding cycle. And there's not a lot of understanding from a lot of POSE projects about what they're supposed to do next and whether fiscal sponsorships are becoming foundations or getting integrated into existing foundations are an option. But it's really, I feel like that's still a question about how that works as a pathway. I've actually been strongly supportive of the idea of universities playing a role in this and maybe becoming the fiscal sponsor for their own projects. And I'm actually starting a pilot with that within UCSC for one project. And ultimately, I also want to figure out how to lower barriers, because I think a lot of this also, these issues also are part of the problem is that there are barriers to collaborations between open source projects and academic researchers that are working maybe in similar fields within the academic setting. And of course, I can't walk away without just trying to figure out how this all impacts me in an academic OSPO. And I put an asterisk next to the OSPOs because it isn't just about something that's called an OSPO, but folks within an academic setting that are kind of trying to promote open source. So, anyways, that is all I'm going to talk. But I just want, again, this part was just setting this discussion up. Like I said, we don't need to go through these questions in this order. I'm sure there are people in this room who have other ideas that may actually be, that may not be in here, and I'd love to actually broaden that discussion up to that. But I maybe just to get it kicked off, I was maybe interested if people wanted to talk about that first question about the pathways, which is kind of the subject, the title of the session. So if you wanted to talk about that, and so I'll open it up to the floor with people who maybe have some thoughts on that.
I was gonna say that. I think that universities providing and for business sponsorship for their for open source projects makes a lot of sense. I think. Like people come up with ideas and then those them to the universities or potentially gain sponsorship.
So in case, I don't know if that came up on the mic, but the idea was that, universities being a kind of the fiscal sponsor and coming, and projects being able to come to them and being supported by them was like a positive development, would be a good way of going. So.
Starting with the first question. So, I've been working in universities since the 90s and also in open source since the 90s. The pathways that are particularly well suited for academic originating open source efforts, the ones that I've seen that work the best fit within the university's normal flow of starting all kinds of projects. So they mostly start as a student's research project. or a professor's research project. But it still fits within the university structure. The university understands, oh, this is a research project. Okay, but it has an open source license.
Right.
And so not trying to think of it as something completely other than academic work, and kind of integrating it really helps in terms of, and then as it grows, yes, the other things move on and go outward. I have seen universities work as fiscal sponsors for open source, and it has worked incredibly well. University of Cambridge has, in the UK, has funded several open source projects quite extensively. But there again, there's always a professor who's the PI. It's a research group. It fits the structure of the university instead of trying to do something foreign and confusing and difficult. And it works quite well. Universities have a system for accepting donations and managing grants and paying for postdocs and students to work on things. So it actually does work quite well.
I'm glad to hear that. No,
I think the mics might only for like the recording. I don't know
Yeah.
for like
Yeah.
the
Yeah,
the audience.
I think it was small brain. They probably didn't.
Yeah.
Just yell.
That's great to hear about that because I think that we've had this. So there's a larger groups of open source program offices in academic settings that are like typically a lot of them are US based, but there are a few from outside that we all kind of talk together. And none of the universities have actually started that process. So it's good to hear. I think I heard some about what like some few other universities have done. So I think that would be really great to kind of model. And I think it is really that the funding, the being able to accept donations and how that works. So the first time I said this to somebody from that group, they're like, "Oh my God, that's your overhead so high." I'm like, "Well, only if it's a grant. If it's a gift, it isn't that bad. It's like 10 or 15%. So I was like, which is comparable to a fiscal sponsor. So like your average fiscal sponsor. So so I thought that was a good positive thing. So yeah, we're trying, like I said, I'm hoping that it becomes more of a norm because I think that especially for research projects, it's projects that aren't necessarily like commercial in nature, and I do that because I'm all like, I think that has a wide scope of what that means. But if you're talking about projects that are particularly academic focused or focused on research, then it's great to be able to support it through the app. And then also the university continues to get credit for the work that was done, even if people move on. So.
You don't need the mic.
No, I don't need the mic for that one. No, I definitely second seeing that pattern of not making it a separate thing, but aligning with whatever the current business process is. So relating this to the marketing context, we've had like, I think 40 or 50 web platforms identified, business logistics standpoint at whatever university I'm from, being off camera right now. And so to help try and dissuade that from continuing, someone was identified as new contracts coming in need to just kind of run by this person to make sure there's some alignment in technical infrastructure. And I almost wonder if a role of academic OSPOs can be similar, where it's this project's coming in, oh, this sounds really interesting. Hey, there are these open source tools that you could be using to pull this off. So it's more of trying to fade open source into the background a little bit more instead of being the primary, so that we're meeting the business objectives, or in my college's case, we're trying to align everything with UN sustainability goals, strategic mission of the institution as a land grant university. I work in Penn State, I don't know. And then also act like with our college's goals. So trying to do like small picture and slightly go out to the larger vision. At no point in there is the focus necessarily on open source. It's just kind of assumed like this is the fabric of what we're doing is going to be open source. And that's made it a lot easier to get the tools worked in the classroom settings, to collaborate with other faculty. It's not just like going out and saying, hey, open source is open source. We're trying to meet this goal as an institution, and by the way, open source is the most logical way to get there.
No, right here.
So as a researcher, I think that one of the things that I struggle the most with, within like my academic work is balancing the what is expected to me as a PhD student and what I want to do for like open source, right? Like as a researcher, I develop tools that I want people to use. But in reality, I'm just expected to write a paper to justify why I did this and like to tell a story in an interesting way. But in reality, what I want to do is build a tool that it's useful, build the documentation around it, build a good contributing guide, like all of these things that in general, I don't really get credit for as an academic, like in my academic career. And these are all of those things that I want to do, but I need to kind of balance like, oh, I need to be writing a paper, not writing documentation, which kind of sucks because I want to do both. And I'm wondering if like maybe like OSPOs can be a way for having some incentives that will, I don't know, help researchers within institutions to get some credit for all of this work that entails building an open source tool. Because yeah, it's true. A lot of the open source tools that come within like academic institutions like start as research projects. And part of my research, I've actually been analyzing like how do these tools look like, and a lot of them actually lack contributing guides, issue templates, like conduct, like code of conduct on that, all of these things. And my guess is because they have the same problem that I have. It's like they don't have the time to do all of these things because they're writing a paper, which is what they're going to get credit for. So yeah, I'm wondering how can the OSPO help with this issue? Maybe I'm not bringing a solution. Maybe I'm bringing another problem.
So that was a great comment that got me thinking, are there ways to kind of hack our way into growing a community around an initiative over the longer term after the initial research team or the student maybe has moved on or maybe the professor has moved on, and what's the long-term sustainability for this effort look like? And often, not that it's good or bad, but oftentimes these research questions are fairly narrow, and so you have kind of an artificially constrained total audience of what a community could look like. But in the social sciences, there's a method that's called action research. And this is where you look for ways to engage the beneficiaries of your work in the research as you go and bring them more into the fold. And so there may be ways using those types of approaches from the very beginning when you're designing your research methods to think about how you structure the project from the beginning to break beyond the walls of the university from the start. And this could help with growth and bringing more resources in, obviously, to the work that's to be done, and to make a larger impact, obviously, which is what the universities are wanting to do as well. So thinking about ways to kind of hack the system and think about alternative research methods. This doesn't always work for things that are very quantitative types of research, but I think in some cases it might be some alternatives.
I like that. I think the interesting idea of like maybe having a I think it's both of these issues is like having a ground, like changing kind of the dynamic of how research starts, let alone just keep going, so that you're not at that point like 2 years down the line and we're like, oh, I have to redo all this work because I didn't start with that mindset. So that might be an interesting way of, I mean, obviously that's a fundamental change from the way like a lot of academic institutions work, definitely you see. But I think it would be really, really useful. And I think, I think it's important to point out that I think the work that you're doing is actually helping answer some of the questions you just brought up too. So which she will be presenting tomorrow after here in this room. Our so about that.
So one of the things, like you mentioned something about like thinking about like from the start of doing research, right? And that is actually one of the things that I also struggle a lot with, in the sense that sometimes I feel like open source and the way that academic work is a little bit incompatible, in the sense that it feels like a competition. It feels like I have to compete with like everyone else around who's doing something similar to be the first one who did this particular thing or solve this particular problem. So if I'm going to do that in the open, then I'm already kind of losing sort of some of that, again, which sucks, because I am huge advocate for open source, and I I push a lot for like opening everything that I do and like making sure it's like, yeah, it's more beneficial if it's collaborative and if there's more people involved. But at the same time, that sort of impacts my academic career because then I'm not winning the race, and I don't know how to like balance those two things either.
I have an answer that actually isn't from open source, though it works well with open source. And that is that you have a research group at a university who have like 10 or 20 people all working on the same project. They will coordinate, they collaborate on the project as a whole, and they will coordinate, okay, you are going to write up this piece in your PhD, and you're going to write up this piece in your PhD thesis, and you two people get to publish this paper. And they actually actively coordinate, making sure that everybody gets credit for a piece of the work, even though they're doing the work all together. So the same thing works in an open source project. You have a bunch of people collaborating, but you make sure that the academic credit comes through for critical pieces of the work. You know, it's like, oh, we added this new feature, we added this new, or here was an interesting performance study on it, or here was an interesting, like, there's always multiple different angles. But it does require, like, setting aside slightly that competition, but from, like, it's almost like a professor who wants to make sure that all of their students, like, you know, get raised up. Who actively coordinates with students and puts their name on some papers and that sort of thing. But it is a slightly different strategy, but it's kind of understanding that actually even in academia where there is competition, the goal is not to kill all of the other people in the university. The goal is to raise up the students. The goal is to raise up the future professors going through the ranks. So it's a little different, but it works.
Although having heard that, I guess I wonder who you consider the competition to be. So if it's folks in other institutions, if it's folks in other departments, I mean, so Allison's describing a system where the competitors are part of the same ecosystem, but maybe for you, they're not, in which case you are putting yourself at a competitive disadvantage by working out in the open and by taking some of your time away from solving the problem to, routinizing the workflows.
So I guess kind of working on that same idea, is there strategies to kind of working in plain sight? So do you have to be naming everything exactly what you're supposed to be doing? Or so like I work at a research platform where we do a lot of that similar stuff. You can pre-register your studies where you're taking your protocols and you're getting a timestamp for the exact time and date you came up with that idea. And you can, on our platform, make that private for up to 4 years while you're completing your study. And I'll talk about that tomorrow when we're doing this full talk in the same room. But part of what we're kind of seeing as well is that if you're going to be combining with some sort of like GitHub repository where everything is public, everything's got to be public, is there a way to kind of hide in plain sight, not naming your project exactly what your exact study is? You're able to work on the code at first glance. Nobody's looking at your stuff. I'm not saying that it's not perfect and you're not being transparent, but if your main concern is scooping, which it is because that's the way the world works, there has to be some sort of balance. And I'm feeling your pain and I'm just trying to brainstorm ideas, I guess.
I'm just following. Is this working? Is this working? Okay, so I'm following up on what Michael said earlier, and I'm not in the academic space. However, one of the issues is that people are leaving academia, having worked on projects. Is there such a thing as like a alumni network after they leave, creating something like that? So that they can continue to participate and then actually become mentors, even though, they're not writing the papers, they're not producing the final work, but they could actually support and contribute to new students that are coming in and existing ones. So I know maybe the US is much better at alumni networks, certainly the UK is not, but I think that what we have is communities within open source using some of those methodologies and creating a larger community around this review. Is there such a thing?
Oh, sorry. That's a good answer the question. That I think that when I look at the alumni networks for projects that are coming out of UCSC, for instance, I know there are still like, especially the ones that we've kept open source. We do have alumni who continue to like work on it because even if they go off and do some other, they work in industry or they go off into another. Go and do, teach somewhere else or something like that as professors. I do see it. I don't think it's strong, but I think it's maybe a way of, but the fact that it's open source allows it. Whereas if it's not an open source project that allows it for, once they leave, they're not allowed if they don't have access to it. I think that would make a big difference. So no, I think that's a good idea. And I think that's something that we could definitely build on and be like part of the whole process of because like with the OSPOs as well. But it also a lot of things depends on the project and the academics that are working on it within the arts to that type of activity within we say open source it's either regular containers.
I was wondering if the open core model could apply to what Juanita was discussing. So like lots of companies these days, especially startups, have like an open core. So you can the core of their project is open, but then they have like in private repos, they have extra stuff. Maybe that's like an enterprise tier version of the core product or whatever. But in the academic context, it could be like you have an open core of like this is a tool that I developed to do this research, and you can share the tool without sharing the research itself until you're ready to publish it, something along those lines, which I'm guessing people already do anyway, but I thought I'd throw it out there just in case.
I'd say one of the things to keep in mind is that open core actually takes a lot more work than not open core.
For such a student.
Yeah. And the reason it works for them is because they make money off of the core. I mean, like, there are technical reasons it's a problem. So in academia, I'd say you're onto the right instinct, which is there are bits and pieces that you share or don't, but it's not necessarily that there's a big open core. Sometimes it's actually like all the code is open, but maybe your performance testing stuff is new, or, you even submit the code into the open, but like until you talk about it, nobody's really paying attention to it anyway. There's bits of that. Sometimes it's, like you have a whole body of a bunch of related projects, and all of the related projects are open except for one little thing. And you don't really publish that till after you publish the paper. Right. There's a bunch of ways you can do it, but yeah. So you can, if it's really, really important that nobody see your code before you publish the paper, you can just keep it. Don't make it public yet. That's fine. Right. In the vast majority of cases, it actually doesn't matter if your code is visible before the paper. Yeah. I think people get caught into thinking, oh, it can't be public. In many cases, it can. You may also find there's some grant funders who don't want stuff to be public.
Right.
Like that is like one of the terms of the grant. And they're fine with it being released as open source after the project is completed, but before they don't want it to. Others, like we've had a lot, like the NSF doesn't mind at all. Right. Like for stuff like that. A lot of the UK funders don't care at all. So yeah, it is a challenge, but I think it's helpful to keep in mind that it's not, I think the way you put it, it's not actually all that much different from the challenge that companies have sometimes had in terms of we want it to be open, and these are the reasons we want it to be open. But yeah, I don't know if that's helpful.
I had a quick. It only actually was started 11:15, or I thought it says it on the schedule 11:15, but I thought it was. So I'm gonna look at you.
I would defer to your schedule.
It says 11:50, but I think on that that one's 11:30. Okay, the online schedule. What do we get out?
One question.
That's just okay.
So this is all.
We
do network
Okay, so I think we're okay until 11.
Thanks, 11:30.
Thank you. I just want to say that before one side comment was that I think that a lot of the OSPOs or a lot of the people who are looking at academic open source in various working groups and are actually specifically trying to address the question that you have too about, and whether we can make it less important that if you got scooped and somebody saw your stuff, that you would still get credit for the work you did and the impact you had, even if for some, somehow it got, seen by somebody else and they published it first. So making sure that you could, it is actually clear that the impact your work had on whatever it was coming on. I think that's also part of like what OSPOs are trying to work on as the basis as well, like to help us, make the ability of having things open more the norm than you not having to do like mental gymnastics to figure out how to do it. I wanted to ask if one thing is that, because I know we do have 15 minutes with it. If we're moving on, I would actually like to put my Imperial colleagues on the spot a little bit about the fiscal quadrant foundations and how they see them fitting in, because I think that's kind of specifically some of the activities that you're interested in.
I didn't know I was allowed to play. I was looking at these questions, and I guess I would take it, including the fiscal sponsorship. The first one, pathway is particularly well suited for academic, or originating, sustainability for the effort. All of these, I think, are 1 degree away, or from what I would start the question from, if I were still working on a campus specifically, is like, what's the value proposition for the campus? Because it's going to be, ideally in my fantasy world, it would be the OSPO is treated no different than the light switches and the plumbing. And this is I think Brian and both Allison said this, is that this is just core services that are best practices to supporting the work happening on our campus. So you have to convince the provost that, there's a value in open source, for open educational resources and open content and open science and open, research and open source software. You have to convince the CIO or the CTO that there's open source is important for research, and also open source is important for administrative computing and academic computing. And so this becomes a culture of practice, and this is how we do our work. This is part of the digital transformation that's occurring on campuses. And so then it's easy to go in, not easy, but then if they understand, oh, this is what we do, just like we need electricity in the room, we need to have services available for our faculty and researchers and students, that they can do this. Because this is going to sound horrible, and Josh Barron says I'm not allowed to say this outside, but my fear is that open source is going to be the MOOCs of 2025, like OSPOs, and that just like that nobody really cared, not that they didn't care. Online learning, distance learning had been happening for years before the MOOC started, right? And all of a sudden some big money came in, and universities were like, wow, we're going to do this because you just came in with this pile of money. And is that happening now? But if the OSPOs can embed themselves into just not something fancy, not something that's even called, how do you convey the value of open source without talking about open source like that? I don't know how to do that. But that's what has to happen, so that they just see it as this, just like nuts and bolts of the university. And then if to get to your specific question finally, the foundations, I think, and the OSPOs should serve as partners. So with this money coming in, it's going away, right? It's not going to last. And Sloan is not going to be able to fund 1,200 institutions of higher education, from community colleges to HBCUs to tribal universities to small teaching colleges to community colleges. And all of those institutions would benefit from open source for a lot of the same reasons. So can there be OSPOs that are seen as centers of excellence in particular areas? And it might be in research for R1s, or it might be for connecting open data and open access publishing with open research or open science. And then there's a network of folks, just like an open source ecosystem itself, where nobody builds everything from scratch again, right? So we have these libraries, or these, I don't know, think of another interface between these systems. And And foundations are doing things, and most foundations are built around a license, technology, scope of practice, or an industry. And those are just working just like OSPOs, but they're not in an academic setting. But now there's a network of complementary efforts that have subject matter expertise that we don't have to replicate, that ends up becoming a reduced cost for the funders and is also embraced by, wow, I guess this is a national thing. Just like we have to have a standard to connect to the power grid on our campus, we have to have a standard for connecting to open source. And foundations are just a complementary node on that network. Sorry for the long answer and the rant.
So I don't have a ton to add. I will just raise another question. So my contribution will be to muddy the waters a little bit further. Yay. So I find myself wondering, we've been talking a lot about research originating open source efforts under the heading of what it says on the slide is academic originating. And I guess I wanted to toss into the mix the notion of efforts that originate in a co-curricular kind of way and what sustainability looks like for those groups. I mean, you could imagine an undergraduate research project that becomes something that is co-curricular, and then generations of students need to be brought into the mix to be able to keep it sustainable and moving forward. So I guess I would put out there the question of what might be the role of an OSPO in that, what might be the role of a foundation or a fiscal sponsor in that, what are some of those challenges?
And connecting to the opening keynote, because sustainability is the same for all open source projects right now, right? You have to have a good story. So I think a big part of this is being an individual faculty member or staff or whoever, and networking with another person on your campus, getting a group of students that do an interesting project, and then getting Marcom in to look at that and say, hey, look at this neat thing that we're doing. I think a lot of this is like, I wish someone on high would just recognize everything we're doing. And like, that's been the tenor of my open source life for 18 years. It's sort of just having to make it happen. So like in going forward the next year, my focus, and I'll be talking about this tomorrow afternoon, is on what's this neat thing that just came up? What existing student organizations on campus can we align with and have them contribute to? So if we need to do translation, for example, to internationalize our system, I should be going to Japanese club if I want to get into that, or the German club or the French club, and there's students that overlap majors that are in these other interest groups. That I think helps bring a larger degree of sustainability, but also a really cool story. And that story then can help elevate the entire project you're working on to try and get that exposure to go after funding. I hope is what's happening at my campus right now.
Yeah, I think stories are important.
So I'm not really very involved in the academic community. I do work on an open source project that started in an academic lab. But I do want to ask this question. So, there's a lot of focus on origination, a researcher developing some new tool. But I want to ask about maintainability. Like when we're talking about sustainability, eventually that student's going to leave the lab. They're going to go on and do something else. They're probably going to leave a fairly large code base behind. And I've heard lots of stories from my colleagues that have worked in academic labs that like a lot of that has become a black box. Nobody knows how it works because nobody worked on it. So how do academic organizations or these, facilities kinds of, structures support long-term maintenance of existing projects? Open source should be like, turning on the lights, but universities have electricians when the lights not working. Like, how do you build that kind of organization?
Well, I know one push within, but not that we haven't quite done yet, but that I know is happening in a lot of universities, is to have research software engineering teams that help, to some extent at least, try and become maintainers for that type of those type of activities. There's also like a lot of initial discussions. I don't know how far they really have gotten on figuring out ways of sunsetting those type of things. So how you, create a system where it's like, well, maybe what you have doesn't need what that is being worked on doesn't need to be maintained. The point about the code, the amount of code gets left behind, and we had one of our open source projects that started at UCSC, and then ended up getting integrated into Apache Arrow. What we learned from that, what a huge part was that, wow, there was a lot of waste, like, because we just didn't know how it worked. Like, we did not realize how much was just of code was just they just got rid of it, and it was way easier to maintain. So having a lot of it's like the part I think what the OSPOs are trying to do was kind of create best practices to understand that, and also create an infrastructure where things don't get lost and things don't get like, the black box is there's somebody touching it at least at some point. So, oh, yeah, 5 minutes.
So to the point of like the code being maintainable, I think that one of the things that I think it's very important is like the way that a code is like initially produced impacts a lot whether it's maintainable or not. So teaching researchers about sustainability, about reproducible environments, about documentation, like all of these things are, yeah, it's essential to eventually the code being maintainable like long term, whether there is someone to maintain it or not. The fact that it's already established in a good way to be maintainable, I think it's, I would say, the starting point. Finding someone else to maintain it, that's, I guess, kind of step 2. But the first thing, it's like from the start, the code has to be produced in a way that it's maintainable long term.
No docs, no doctorate.
I like it. She said, no docs, no doctorate for those.
One thing from the sustainability standpoint that at least we've been noticing, so we won a POS grant, but it was to build an open source community. And one thing that we've been noticing is that it's a lot easier to start something than to keep it alive long term. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And looking around the open source ecosystem, you'll see, especially in academia, you talk about there's generations of grad students who are maintaining these projects. Eventually it gets to a point where it potentially could die on the vine. You're talking about sustainability and sunsetting these projects. So especially when we're applying for grants, thinking about where is this going to live long term. So in our particular project, we've actually shifted our mindset away from the general community aspect of building an open source ecosystem where you have just bunches of people coming in and helping out. And it's more targeting these groups, these academic groups, the former POS winners, and then building a space where they can not sunset their work, but they know that it'll have a larger impact and reach more users, reach more people who are like-minded in your work. I'm going to be talking more about that tomorrow in my talk, but that's just kind of shifting in that narrative of, do I need to be the one that keeps this alive long-term? Where am I going to see the most amount of eyes and the most amount of impact for my open source project? It's kind of an interesting switch in narrative for sustainability.
Right, we have 2 minutes left, so so you,
Yeah.
Does anybody else have not that I was shut down. I really engaged just
No, I am. You do pay, so okay.
All right, I'm gonna give this comment and then we can.
Yeah, I just want to say that piggybacking on what you were saying, I think that something that is could be helpful, and it's helped me, is understanding how impactful creating open source can be long term. I think that I've done a lot of things in my career, and most of the things that I've accomplished have come from me being involved in open source. And because I learned that, I have not kind of like left the open source space. And I think for a student who has developed open source work within their academic path, understanding that could probably like keep them there, like not leave their projects behind, but kind of grow their career with their projects. And I think that's something that probably OSPOs and like anyone who is pushing for open source can help. Maybe help students understand that impact.
All right, I'm gonna wrap it up with that. I also realized what I should have done when I forgot was to actually create a slide with resources for those. And a few things popped up while we were talking. So when I upload the slides, I will add a resources page. It'll include links to links to the Curious Group, which is the group of open source program offices that not primarily, but a lot of them were Sloan funded, but also other groups, as well as other resources that would I think work on some of these issues that we talked about.
Well, thank you for facilitating the discussion. Thank you everyone for coming. And sorry for the confusion at first. I didn't introduce Stephanie. That's other Sorry for being rude.
All right, thanks everybody.